The next speaker is Professor Oustinoff from the University of Nice, Sophia, Antipolis.
Well, first of all, thank you, of course, to the organizers of this very interesting conference. Of course, the Istituto Italiano, the Institut Français, and of course our sub-colleagues and the welcome that I had here. And so I'm French actually, and so I'm going to use English. I know that, in fact, as you may have seen on the program, the language is not, there's no language after the title of my talk, because I'm going to use several languages, so I hope that you won't condemn me for using English, at least in the title. And right from the start, the title is also, of course, in French. That's the, because France thinks that, you know, it's the center of the world, so sometimes here and, well, but, so the title of this talk is Globalization and the Translation of Imaginaries, Mondialisation et Traduction des Imaginaires. Let me see if this works. Yes. Okay, so by way of introduction, so that's, since I know Russian also, I'd like to make a quotation by Roman Jakobson. I'm going to translate it. Don't be afraid, in English afterwards. It's not written in Serb, but my Serb colleagues will probably see some kind of affinity with their own language, so I'm going to quote it in Russian, of course. Сталкиваясь с другим славянским языком, славяне прежде всего ощущают его общность со своим собственным. Он либо недооценивает разницу и эгоцентрически переинтерпретирует родственный язык, либо он чувствует расхождение, и они или его привлекают, или отталкивают. Which means, when coming into good contact with another Slavic language, a Slav, first and foremost, feels the common ground with its own language. Either he underestimates the difference and he reinterprets the related language in an egocentric way, or he feels the divergences between the two, and either he will be attracted by them or repelled by them. So personally, I'm rather attracted by the Serb language rather than repelled, and the same goes, of course, for Romance languages such as French, Italian, Spanish, Portuguese, my mother language, and also for Germanic languages such as English, German, Dutch, and so on. And if you add all those families, the three languages, the related sub-families of languages in Europe, you've got at least 16 languages among the 24 languages that the European Union has now. So I think that was a good starting point. And so let's get down to the imaginative languages, which contain in the title an untranslatable, according to Barbara Cassin, whom I know personally and I worked with, several times. But I'm not a philosopher. Let me add that from the start, But I'll return to the untranslatable of imaginaire later on. So my second quotation will be in French, and again, I'm going to translate it into English afterwards. So, quote, it's from Edouard Glissant. Edouard Glissant, by the way, was already mentioned by another speaker. And so, quote, it's taken from the Introduction to a Poetics of the Diverse, which was published in 1996, and quote in French, Je pense que dans l'Europe du XVIIIe et du XIXe siècle, même quand un écrivain français connaissait la langue anglaise ou la langue italienne ou la langue allemande, il n'en tenait pas compte dans son écriture. Les écritures étaient monolingues. Aujourd'hui, même quand un écrivain ne connaît aucune autre langue, il tient compte, qu'il le sache ou non, de l'existence de ces langues autour de lui dans son processus d'écriture. On ne peut plus écrire une langue de manière monolingue, on est obligé de tenir compte des imaginaires des langues. In other words, I think that in the Europe of the 18th and 19th centuries, even when a French writer knew the English language or the Italian language or the German language, he did not take it into account in his writing writings were monolingual. Today, even when a writer doesn't know any other language, he takes into account, willingly or unwillingly, of the existence of those languages around him in his writing process. We can no longer write a language in a monolingual way. We are forced to take into account the imaginaries of languages, unquote. So, a writer, and this is also, I'm going to apply this also to reading. We cannot read literature in a monolingual way any longer with globalization. Now, how can you take into account, a writer or reader, take into account the imaginaries of other languages when you know only your own? Well, obviously, one of the reasons why, of course, is because there is translation. And translations can be, you know, the intralingual translation, because Roman Jakobson is also quoted in that regard. So it's, as well as, of course, a translation proper, from English into German, whatever, and intersemiotic translation, because now we are, someone mentioned also acceleration of history today and globalization. We are submitted to a constant flow of different cultures through the internet, films, DVDs, and so on and so forth, music, you name it, something that was unthinkable only 30 years ago, before the internet. You know, that was the Stone Age through the era in which I was born, and I suppose many of you around here. So, well, I've taken another example. I've translated it myself into English. It's from Milorad Pavic, The Fish Skin Hat. So, a good way to show that translation is already in a text is, well, I just came across this short story or that tale by Milorad Pavic. I suppose it's not somebody unknown around here. And well, I translated it into English, and this is what it gives, because there are several languages included in the passage. Inter os et offa multa accidere possunt, Arcadius read, on an oil lamp. To understand the inscription, Arcadius translated immediately into Greek. Between the mouth and the mouthful, many a thing may happen. The young boy knew already how to read Greek, and now he was learning how to read Latin. But what is interesting is the fact that it says Arcadius knew Greek, and he translated immediately into Greek, but you don't have the Greek text. You've got the Latin text, but not the Greek one. So that's quite interesting. It's as if, you know, it's a willing suspension of disbelief, as Coleridge would say, in which you just feel, you almost hear the Greek, but there's no Greek in the text. So this is what it gives in my horrible Serb accent. In Serb it goes like this. Inter os et offa multa accidere possunt, citauje Arcadie, natpise jedne zemljane svetilke. Da bi razume šta piše, Arcadije odmah prevede natpis na grčke. Između usta i zalogaja mnogo se šta može dogoditi. Mladić je već ranije znao da čita na grčkom, ali sada je učio da čita latinski. So I can understand it, well, through not Greek or Latin, but through Russian, because there are 4 out of 5 words that I can connect to other Russian words. So this is what Roman Jakobson told about the fact that when somebody who knows a Slavic language comes into contact with another Slavic language, he feels some kind of familiarity, and that communication is possible. Although some people might say that it is impossible. So since I think the next speaker will talk about subtitles, I suppose, or films. No.
Norms.
But norms, okay. So, well, good. So I'm not going to say anything that you might say afterwards. So, for instance, I've got here a DVD, you know, it's called Arrival. I don't know if you saw the film, you know, it's about a linguist who is asked to decipher and translate extraterrestrial languages. And I've got this, in the original in English, and I've got that also with Serbian subtitles, so that helps me to practice Serbian. And even in that case, translation is possible. So you see, there's hope for those who believe that translation is possible, although it is also impossible at the same time. That was just a digression, of course, as there will be many of them, unfortunately, afterwards. Now, to quote Jacques Derrida, he said in Détour de Babel, so I think it was translated by On Towers of Babel back in 1985. So you've got the French text and the translation in English, the official translation I have to add. Quote, on ne devrait jamais passer sous silence la question de la langue dans laquelle se pose la question de la langue et se traduit un discours sur la traduction. I said it slowly because that's not the kind of sentence you can really say fast if you want the people in the room, in the assistants to understand it. And in English, because one should never pass over in silence the question of the tongue, in which the question of the tongue is raised and into which a discourse on translation is translated. So I think it suits the situation here well, and not only for my talk, but for all the talks that you heard yesterday and probably the ones you'll hear later on today. Language and translation are linked, as it were, and so there's a paradox of translation. Also, the word paradox was used in Greek etymologically. It means that which goes against para, doxa. In philosophical terms, doxa can be used, but the first meaning in Greek of doxa, arkadios, would not be against that interpretation. It means what is expected. So that's which runs counter to experience, to shared knowledge, is a paradox etymologically. The third paradox of translation is, hence, the possibility or impossibility of translation. Let me quote now, it's from a quotation by Julien Green, who's a French writer. Unfortunately, he died, and his parents were American, and he lived in Paris, and he became a French writer, and he wrote a bilingual book just like this one, but he was both the author and the translator, and this gave me the idea well, fortunately, the story ended well, to embark on a PhD on self-translation, and that was the first step, the book which gave me the idea, and it's entitled in French, Le langage et son double, and he translated it himself, Languages in Shadows. It's not a language and its double, which might have been a translation translated by language and its shadow and language. So since he was a self-translator, traduttore, traditore, he could betray himself as he wished, so that's the good thing about when you translate yourself, you can do anything you want, or almost. So, quote, this is the English part of what was initially written in French, I think. I'm not quite sure, but anyway, it wouldn't change the issue at all. There are 2 points. The first one is, it's called the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis. It goes back to at least Wilhelm von Humboldt and the romantic notion of translation, something that actually appeared only in the 19th century. And, I'm not a philosopher, but Wilhelm von Humboldt was a worshipper of Kant, and he thought that his critique of pure reason, critique der reinen Vernunft, there was something missing, the language, and so he added something, as it were, to that philosophical system. But I'm not a specialist. I'm not going to tread on uncertain ground. So, quote, there's 2 points. The first one is the French language interprets the universe in one way, the English language is in another. It is the same universe seen from different angles. So it's both impossible, but at the same time, it means that when you read something in another language, it adds something to the original. It's transformation, but it adds something. Right, so there are different ways to, of course, interpret this. And the second point which he makes, because it's not, Julien Green is not or he calls himself Julian with an A, as indifference with a river, with an E or with an I, with an A. He's not a philosopher, but he sees that from a literary point of view, and this is what it gives. Point number 2. We may be tolerably certain that had Keats been born French, he might have written a poem called Endymion, but the contents of that poem would have been different. To put it in other words, a French translation of Endymion, as we know it, can in no wise represent what Keats would have written had he written in French instead of English, because the mere sound of French words would have suggested an entirely different set of images. So, of course, this applies to literature, but to some extent this may be applied to anything, including the passage, I quoted by Derrida, because, in fact, it's not the same context. It is a French concept, the concept of French school of thought, as it's called, on the one hand, and then it is translated into English, and it is another tradition of thought. So it can be applied, of course, also to philosophy and literature. And not only literature, but it can also be applied to everyday life. For instance, I was late this morning because there was an accident, a car accident. No one hurt, and I survived, and the driver who was supposed to, Jean-Baptiste Cousin, was supposed to bring me here, was unhurt too, but so I was alone in a taxi to come over here, and of course the driver spoke Serbian, which is not very surprising in this place. And so I said that I spoke Russian, and so we began to communicate, because of the proximity of Slavic languages. And in fact, that reminds me of a quotation by Nelson Mandela. It said, if you speak to a man in a language he understands, you talk to his head. If you speak in his own language, you will talk to his heart, you will speak to his heart. So that's why when I go to a country, and particularly a country with whom we share so much in common, I use the language of the country, because this is a way to not only communicate, in intellectual terms, but also with the heart, because this is what matters in everyday life, too. Emotion is also important, and and communication. It's about also emotions and the heart. Now, language and translation. Oh, no, I'm not going to do this again. Right. So, in fact, after this first part, about languages and translation, of course, there's a traduttore, traditore. Now, of course, since the beginning of time, or almost, or at least in the Western world, when they translated texts. Incidentally, in Greece, there was no word for translate, as Baba Kansa explained in Paris a few years ago, because it was meaningless to have translation, because Greek was the only language. But that mattered against the barbarian world of the barbers who just used ununderstandable words for a Greek-speaking person who spoke, of course, only Greek, or was supposed to. But they were, of course, translators. But translation, as such, was useless to the classical world of Greece in the 5th century BC. Now, as soon as translation began, at least in the Western world, and of course from Greek into Latin, Cicero was, of course, mentioned, and so on and so forth. Right from the start, the problem was the difference, and so the difference between languages, and so what was lost and what was gained, and translation was soon something that included a loss instead of gains. Now, a quotation which I find quite interesting is by Salman Rushdie, called it "Imaginary Homelands." So we are in the realm of imagination and the imaginaries. Quote, and this is untranslatable actually in French, because in French we have the word translation in Latin, and then we have tradurre, traduction in French. So it is untranslatable and translatable at the same time in this quotation. Quote, the word translation comes etymologically from the Latin for bearing across. Same thing in Russian. Pierre, what? bearing a cross. Having been born with an E, you know, but there's we think, of course, of to be born, to be carried, but also to be born. I was born in India, we would say, Salman Rushdie. Having been born across the world, we are translated men. We're both translation and carried over the world, as it were. It is normally supposed that something always gets lost in translation. I cling obstinately to the notion that something can also be gained, unquote. So in the time of globalization, in fact, I think that, of course, Salman Rushdie is a writer, and most of us around here aren't as well-known writers as he is, and perhaps we aren't even writers in the literary meaning of the word. But more and more people are being born across the world, something that was not the case only 30 years ago. For instance, just to give one figure, back in the 1950s, there were about 25 to 50 million tourists around the world. Today, there are more than 1.3 billion tourists around the world. So we get, either we can travel, and students now go abroad much more easily, for instance, in Europe with the Erasmus program and so on. I even have students, you know, who go to India, you know, to study. Any place today can be a place where you can go to. And even if you don't go there, with the internet, with DVDs and so on, you can have access to other cultures instantly, as it were, the speed of light. So I found that particularly interesting, not only from a literary point of view, but also from, well, the point of view of everyday life. Now, the point is, what is being translated? And a very interesting book, I think, on this is a book by Northrop Frye, Canadian literary critic, who wrote The Great Code, The Bible and Literature, in 1983, or 1912, whatever. And this, I think, can be articulated, linked to the Humboldt hypothesis, Sapir-Whorf, so on, Derrida, and the rest. Unquote, says, clearly then, one of our first problems is to determine the positive reality of translation, the essential thing or force or process that translation translates. So this is quite interesting. Well, he poses the question, but it hasn't really, well, he answers it in a way, but I think the question, this is what my philosophy teachers taught me when I was at school, the questions are more important than the answers, so I think that's definitely a good problem. Etymologically in Greek, problem is something that you put forward, problema. Now, again, you know, so there won't be any definitive answer to the questions I ask, of course, you know, so that's what my teachers were philosophers told me, so that's quite convenient, you know. But let me quote now an historian, because I work also in Paris at the National Center for Scientific Research, or CNRS, with people from a lot of different disciplines, not only philosophers, but also historians, for instance, who are now interested in translation. 30 years ago, it wasn't the case, but today, no historians will say, oh, that's very interesting, you work on translation studies, and to us, translation is central, is key. This is a quotation by Peter Burke, who's a historian, and wrote that article, and that's a conference, I think, back in 2005, entitled Lost and Found in Translation, A Cultural History of Translators and Translating in Early Modern Europe. Quote, another way of discussing the consequences of cultural encounters, you know, just like Arrival, you know, when you meet Alien, you know, the aliens. Another way of discussing the consequences of cultural encounters, or the cultural consequences of encounters, is to speak of a double process of decontextualizing and recontextualizing, first reaching out to appropriate something alien, and then adapting it to one's own culture. And the bold script is mine, the stress is mine. Translation may be regarded as a kind of litmus paper that makes the process unusually visible. So a litmus paper is something, well, it's a metaphor from chemistry. A litmus paper is what you know, if you, well, to decide if it's an acid or not, so you put that. I think everyone tried this at school. So it's something that reveals the invisible, and it only appears when you have it side by side. you know, just like a paradigm. This is something that is just, paradigm is something that you put side by side and then it becomes a model. It must be admitted that decontextualization and recontextualization produce losses as well as gains. So this is the same problematics, as it were. So this is lost first. So because there's loss too, and lost and gain in translation, this is what Salman Rushdie says in Imaginary Homelands. Quote, "It may be that writers in my position, but I think it applies not only to him, but to a lot of people who don't even have to leave their own country to feel that feeling of loss, of not being like the others, or having to come to terms with something that is beyond ourselves. It may be that writers in my position, exiles or emigrants or expatriates, are haunted by some sense of loss, some urge to reclaim, to look back even at the risk of being mutated into pillars of salt." Well, this is the Bible again. But if we do look back, we must also do so in the knowledge that our physical alienation from India almost inevitably means that we will not be capable of reclaiming precisely the thing that was lost, that we will, in short, create fictions, not actual cities or villages, but invisible ones, imaginary homelands, Indias of the mind. And of course, it's not only Indias, that it can be Serbias of the mind, or Frances of the mind, and so on and so forth, you name it. I think that this is quite interesting. This also applies to a writer I know better and than Salman Rushdie, because I've worked more on Vladimir Nabokov than on Salman Rushdie. And Salman Rushdie wrote, as far as I know, only in one language, although in his own language, English, there are other cultures than just English. Which makes it quite interesting. It means that you have, of course, this is what Truman Jacobson said about intralinguistic translation. You've got a translation within your own language with other cultures included, and languages perhaps, which is something that Edouard Glissant in the first quotation also said. So, and to quote George Bernard Shaw, for instance, I don't know if it was him or Oscar Wilde who said that Britain and the United States are divided by the same language. So there are quite a lot of things going on in one language only, including the fact that you can have, through translation, the addition of other languages without your having to know them and speak them, as it were, with native speakers. So what about the imaginary homelands of Vladimir Nabokov? This is what he said in English. It had taken me some 40 years to invent Russia. He was born in St. Petersburg in 1899, and he went over to, well, first he stayed in Berlin. Well, after the revolution, he stayed in Berlin. He studied in Cambridge, and because right from his childhood he knew French, Russian, and English almost, on the same level. And he returned to Berlin. Unfortunately, he married a Jewish wife, Vera Nabokov, so they had to flee again. And they found refuge in France, unfortunately, in 1937. Unfortunately, I don't know why, but Germans wanted to travel too, and so they caught up with the Nabokovs in France. So they left France in 1940. So in the first 40 years, he invented Russian Western Europe through the Russian language. And now is faced by the task of inventing America, because in America, well, there were no more readers that could read him in Russian, so we had to write in English. And this is incidentally with English that he became a famous international writer, a globalized writer before the time, as it were. So in fact, he had three imaginaries and not just one. Quote, again, I'm an American writer, born in Russia, educated in England, where I studied French literature, before moving to Germany for 15 years. My head speaks English, my heart speaks Russian, and my ear speaks French. Incidentally, at the center is Russian, because it's the heart that speaks Russian, so the most important language for him is actually Russian, the language of the heart. But, of course, English, he knew English quite well, and French, his French was quite well too, because it was perfectly trilingual from the start, something that more and more people are throughout the world, you know, because more than half of the population of this planet is multilingual, you know, and in the Balkans you come across people who know 3, 4, 5 languages, and it's not, you know, some kind of deed, you know, that is supposed to be so extraordinary. Whereas in monolingual or traditional monolingual countries like France, but it or the nation state, as it were, this seems a little more stranger, as it were. But this is a different point, another digression, so I suppose there will be plenty of questions perhaps on that or other topics, I don't know, after my talk. So the case of course, you know, Lolita, well, you became a world-famous writer with Lolita, which he wrote in English, actually, back in 1955, quite late in his life, you know, because he was 56 at the time, and then really he became famous, of course, in 1958, around that time, and 1962, when his film was globalized by Stanley Kubrick's adaptation of Lolita as a film, you know, with a slightly older girl than Lolita is actually in the book, but for understandable reasons. Now, he wrote also, and I'd like to concentrate not on Lolita itself, at least now, but on Ardor or Ardor, which actually wrote in 1969, well, one of these last books, and one that he thought was also key in his work, because it's trilingual. It's written in 3 languages at the same time. And I'll just concentrate on the title itself, Ardor or Ardor. So you can actually read, it's quite a very difficult book to read, but on the internet there's called Ardor Online, which explains all the intertextuality of the book, which is quite difficult. If you don't have the apparatus, you know, to read it, I think it's unreadable. But so this is what Brian Boyd, the specialist in Nabokov, of course, writes about the title. Ardor, quote, combines the Russian a, da, I think in Serbia everybody understands what that means, and the rather less affirmative Russian ada of hell. It is the genitive of at, which means ad, which means also hell. And for instance, in the text, it's written in Russian, but with a Latin script. Теперь из ада, literally, now out of hell. And another one is ada, which means out of hell, of Hades, and so on. But in fact, it is a book that translates itself constantly, because it is meant, first of all, English-speaking readers, and so every time you see something written in French or English or Russian, it is translated into English. So it's completely readable for somebody who knows only English. But it's a kind of readable Finnegan's Wake. I haven't been able to read Finnegan's Wake, but this is a readable Finnegan's Wake. So if you want to read Finnegan's Wake, start with Ardor or Ardor. I think it will be easier. And two, that's Ardor indicates the Russian. This is also a point of orality in the written text. Ardor indicates the Russian rather than American pronunciation of Ardor's name, demonstrated by Marin. This is the Ardor's sister in the book, Pages, and so on. She pronounced it the Russian way with 2 deep, dark A's, make it sound rather like Ardor. So there's an echo effect here. Well, it works quite well when it is translation into French, Ada ou l'Ardeur. In Russian, it doesn't work that well. It wasn't translated by Nabokov by somebody else. It's Ada или страсть, Ada or passion. But I was in Turkey 2 weeks ago, and I saw how it was translated into Turkish, and it's Ada ya da arzu. And it's quite interesting because arzu means desire. Ada or desire, and you've got the same sound, you know, although Turkish has got, to my knowledge, nothing to do with any Slavic language. Perhaps a linguist, you know, would show no this. But no, it hasn't any relationship, and yet it suits the translation quite well, even better than in Russian in that respect. But Ada means, I asked my Turkish colleagues, Ada is also the name of a woman in Turkey, but it also means island. So when you translate, you've got other connotations, and so this is how, and it's just quite good for the book itself. So you add other dimensions, other strata, as it were, to a book when you translate it also. So you don't only subtract, but you add also something. Now, that is my last point. How much? Few minutes. Okay, so I'm going to sum up the last part of the paradox of Lita. So, in fact, the paradox is the following. Well, he self-translated himself from Russian into English, and all his translations were considered as brilliant, and nobody criticized them. And even he said that to translate his Russian novels into a third language, you had to translate it from the English version, which to him was the definitive version. But so he tried only once or twice to translate himself into Russian, into Russian. The first one was his biography, and the second time, and his autobiography, Speak Memory, was translated as Другие берега in Russian, which means other shores, and it was translated in French by Другие берега, Autre Rivage, which is the Russian title of his Russian self-translation, but not the title of the initial biography in English. But that is a different point. But anyway, it was, people, Russian-speaking people, thought that this was a marvelous translation written in perfect Russian, but not. It didn't happen with the Lolita, which is translated into Russian. People were amazed at such a bad piece of writing. And said, wow. And so that was the return, the paradox of the return, that was, the most cherished book that he wrote in English, and he thought that to him, he wrote English much worse than he could in Russian. And so it was homecoming. Oh, I can translate it into Russian, and everybody will perhaps prefer it in Russian than in English. But unfortunately, life, well, you know what it's like, as we say in French, c'est la vie. And so something bad happened to Lolita R. So it was thought of as un-Russian by the Russian themselves. And my hypothesis, and this is what I explained back in, last July in St. Petersburg at the Nabokov Museum. I was invited there, so there were a lot of specialists and Russian-speaking people. So, anyway, they agreed with my explanation, so I'm quite pleased, or perhaps they were polite, in fact they have a completely different point of view, but I don't know, that's the problem for untranslatability and communication. But, there are two schools of thought, actually. On the one hand, people would say, well, this is just, he tried to include English phrases. Well, he had lost his control of his Russian, of his native, because of time, times wears everything off, and so he just wrote badly Russian, but his biography is written in perfect Russian. So the second alternative, and this is one I argue that is the right one, in fact, he tried to translate into Russian the creativeness that he had found via English. But the Russian readership wasn't ready for that kind of stylistic transformations, and so they preferred translations made by somebody else, because this would be a Russian domesticated translation, and this is what they were waiting for. But today, perhaps, as time goes by, they will be ready one day to accept the Russian Lolita for what it is, a creative self-translation that brought novelty to the Russian language. Well, this is at least the point of view I share, as it were, and it is mine, so it's easy to share that point of view, but you may agree or disagree with it as you please. Now, so I've summed up that part, and I'll switch on to, I'll pass on to the conclusion. In fact, there's, that's my French drive, as it were, not the deaf drive, but the French drive. So I'm going to quote Proust, Marcel Proust, who said, I'm going to translate it directly so as not to take too much time. You have the quotation in French anyway. The only people who defend the French language as the army during the Dreyfus affair are those who attack it. But the idea that there's there's a French language that exists outside of writers and that we can protect is unbelievable. Every writer is forced to make his own language, as every violinist is forced to make his own sound. The only way to defend one's language is to attack it. So this is what Nabokov did in Russian, and of course, he worshipped Marcel Proust, incidentally. So, so what on my PhD, this is what I wrote, and it was published too back in 2001. Yes, and this is what I call the dissentedness of Nabokov's writing. Again, I'm going to translate in English. I'm going to self-translate myself, you know. So God helps those who help themselves. So, incidentally, I don't want to be rude to the interpreters at the other end of the room. This was just a joke and not intended to them, of course. So, in other words, the reception with the Russian-speaking public was a case of misunderstanding that could be expressed in the following manner. Nabokov's self-translation was not apprehended as such, not as an authorial translation, but as an allographic translation. Allographic means written by somebody else than the author himself. This is what the Russian reader wanted to find was the American Lolita, as a translator other than Nabokov himself would have made it, a Russian Lolita that would be target-oriented. That was a Russian Lolita, which was not the case of Lolita in the first place. And so conclusion, right? So to conclude, in fact, you know, Nabokov is dead, but people did not really understand. Of course, it was impossible to understand it when he died back in 1979, but in fact, he was not a writer of the 20th century only. He was a writer of the 21st century. This is what Jane Grayson, who, in a marvelous book, but this is the only point I disagree with her, because she said that Lolita, for instance, could not be analyzed as such because it was too badly written, as it were, that translation. But here I agree with her, because she says, another part of the book, she says that the brilliance of Nabokov's later English style owes not a little to his viewpoint as a foreigner. At its best, this foreignness, this fresh, off-center vision, can make for this strangeness that estrananie, which means estrangement, strana means country, so estrangement, as it were, which in the estranienie, this is a concept by Shklovsky, one of the Russian formalists, in which this is what literature was about for him, something that there was an aesthetic distance that allowed a literary work to work on its own terms and give an insight into reality that you could get nowhere else than in literature. Return to the question, that astranenie, which is central to all artistic perception. And yes, so I'll just, before thanking you, of course, in the languages of this conference, there's a last quotation by Proust, who said, and it's quoted by Gilles Deleuze, by the way, somebody you are conversant with, of course, and was also mentioned during this conference, I think. Les beaux livres sont écrits dans une sorte de langue étrangère. Beautiful books are written in a kind of foreign language. This is Contre Saint-Beuve by Proust again. And well, I'll finish it, finish this talk, and I think it's the least I can do. I'm going to quote Vladimir Nabokov in Russian itself and translate it afterwards. This is what he wrote in a postscriptum to Lolita in Russian. Издавая Лолита по-русски, я преследую очень простую цель. Хочу, чтобы моя лучшая английская книга, или, скажем, еще скромнее, одна из лучших моих английских книг, была правильно переведена на мой родной язык. By publishing Lolita in Russian, my aim is quite simple. I want my best English book, or more modestly, one of my best English books to be translated correctly in my own native language, unquote. And incidentally, this is quite a good way to finish our talk, he wrote out on the 7th of November 1965 in Palermo. So you see, so the Istituto Italiano will appreciate that final note, that final, it was intentional. Well, it was by chance, you know, so Siedmowolnia brać, zaczęła w 10 Piotr Palermo. Thank you, chwala, merci, grazie.